Hello and welcome to today's webinar on researching the Deep South. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's program. This event is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center, and American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. I do want to note that we are still broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. If we were to lose connection, not to worry, you will have access to a full recording on our website and YouTube channel. Our presenter today is genealogist Ann Lawthers. Ann assists visitors to the American Ancestors Research Center, both in the building and online, with their family history research. She is a graduate of Wellesley College and the Harvard School of Public Health with master's and doctoral degrees in health policy. With a long interest in history and family research, Ann lectures frequently on behalf of us, American Ancestors, and her areas of particular interest include New England and New York, the Mid-Atlantic states, the Southern colonies, Ireland, and migration patterns. So chances are, if you are tuning into this presentation, you have ancestors from the Deep South. So over the next 45 to 50 minutes, Ann will address some of the challenges in researching families from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. She will offer tips and solutions for moving ahead in your genealogical project, and will also look at migration and settlement patterns, what to do when vital records are not available, how to leverage a variety of records, and then provide some tips for conducting African American research in the region. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is a syllabus for this session that can be purchased from our online bookstore. You'll find a link to this downloadable PDF in your reminder emails, as well as in the follow-up email that I will send after today's broadcast. And we are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website. So if you miss something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Ann.
Thank you, Ginevra. Whether your vision of the Deep South is a hot and wet ecosystem, or perhaps the Gulf Coast, maybe farmland, or perhaps mountains, this lecture will provide you with an overview of the challenges and resources for researching in the Deep South. We don't have time to tackle any single topic in detail, so I will be giving you a high-level overview and pointing you to additional resources which are included in the handout. This slide gives you the roadmap for the next 45 to 50 minutes. I will begin with a summary of research challenges for genealogists and a description of the incremental settlement patterns of the regions, so that you will have a sense of when records used by genealogists began in the different areas. Next, as Ginevra mentioned, I'll highlight some of the challenges and suggest strategies for addressing them, and then present several key record groups that you must use. Finally, the methods for researching your African American ancestor will be covered and divided into tools pre and post Civil War. Let's start by defining the states that are being covered by this talk. The South is often defined as including all the states that are tinted yellow, orange, and red in this diagram. As our time is limited, this talk is focusing on the Deep South, the states in red. Genealogical research in the Deep South presents some unique challenges. As an historically agrarian society, the record keeping tended to focus on land records and records required for trade. Vital records, that is, birth, marriage, and death records kept by government, were scarce. The flip side, there are generally great records to document land ownership, such as deeds, tax, and court records. A second challenge is pervasive record loss. Not only courthouse fires, which led to the phrase burned county, but also damage from floods and humidity. Have you ever seen mold on a piece of paper? It's not pretty. One of the mainstays of genealogical research is the U.S. federal census, but there are several decades where these records are missing from Deep South states. Finally, there are the challenges of researching ancestors who had been enslaved. Records either don't exist or exist in forms that are challenging to use. So what is a researcher to do? Let's start by first reviewing some of the settlement patterns. Before Europeans arrived, many native tribes lived in this region. This particular map from Charles Paulin's Atlas of Historical Geography shows the linguistic groups of the native tribes at the time of 1600. The area in brown spoke the Muskegon language, while the yellow represents the Iroquois language, and you will note that the Cherokee, who are from, who inhabited North Carolina and South Carolina, Western South Carolina, were part of the Iroquois language group, and the pinkish area represents the Siouan group. We see that the specific tribes include the Catawba in South Carolina, the Creeks in Georgia and Alabama, with the Chickasaw and Choctaw in Mississippi and Alabama. In Louisiana, we've got the Natchez, Attakapas, and Caddo groups. The first European charter in the South was for the province of Carolina, which was established in 1663, and that is the area that essentially goes from here, up here on the, what is now Virginia, all the way down to what's part of Florida. It split into North and South Carolina in 1712, and what is now Georgia was part of the Carolinas until 1732. All colonies and subsequent states interpreted their original charters as extending from the coast all the way to the Mississippi River. Although European settlers interpreted their charters as encompassing vast tracts of land, the reality was that settlement occurred mostly along the coast, as the First Nation tribes were firmly ensconced in the areas to the west. Note the red line that goes north-south in this diagram. At the end of the French and Indian Wars, King George of England made a proclamation forbidding new settlements to the west of this line. The line was drawn to protect the native hunting grounds. Essentially, it meant that anything west of the Appalachian mountain chains was off limits for settlement. Georgia received its own charter in 1732, as shown by this lovely purple outline. And it was expanded to cover all the light yellow area in 1763. Now notice that the Spanish area, which was controlled by, or which controlled Florida, extended all along the Gulf Coast to the Mississippi. As mentioned earlier, the actual settlement was constrained by geography and relations with the native people and the British Crown. So large areas were claimed, but the coastal area is where the settlement occurred. In this particular diagram, the settlement before 1600 before 1660 is shown in red, settlement up to 1700 is shown in yellow, and then all the way up to almost the Revolutionary War is shown in green. So you can see that it really does hug the coast for the early settlement. After the Revolutionary War, the prohibition on settlement west of the Appalachians was removed, and the new states entered into a frenzy of deal-making for the land controlled by the native tribes. So let's talk a little bit about migration patterns. In colonial times, the settlers Carolinas and Georgia either arrived by sea or by one of the colonial roads. The upper road, which is here in brown, the fall line, which is in red, were two major ways of getting into South Carolina and eastern Georgia. The Scots-Irish settlers did come into the Carolinas mostly via the fall line road. The map here on the left shows the quickened pace of land transfers or land cessations after the Revolutionary War. The gray area are lands that were ceded prior to the war. The green lands were ceded up until about 1810, and the pink lands were ceded up to 1830, and the blue lands were the last to be ceded. Following land cession, new settlers entered the territory using the existing native paths and routes. Settlers to northern Alabama and northern Mississippi tended to originate in Tennessee, as shown by this arrow, while the mid-Alabama and mid-Mississippi areas were settled by migrants from Georgia and the East Coast. And there were two very specific Indian trails that facilitated this westward movement. One pretty much along this top arrow and the other along this bottom arrow. Moving on to the challenges and the records. The keys to success in Deep South research are: 1, you need to understand the history, geography, and record-keeping practices of your ancestors' state and county. 2nd, you need to identify and use alternative sources of information. And 3rd, you need to make liberal use of the fan club strategy, which I will talk about in a moment, to expand your search beyond just your ancestors. As a researcher, one of your first tasks is to educate yourself about your ancestors' state and county. Let's suppose your ancestors lived in what is present-day Walker County, Alabama, from, say, 1817 to 1850. The question is, where would you find records? An even more basic question is, did Walker County even exist in 1817? The Newbery Atlas, as shown on this page, is one of the online tools that can help you determine what jurisdiction your ancestor lived in at which specific point in time. From the Atlas's homepage, which is shown here on the upper left-hand corner, you select your state. At the next page, shown at the bottom right, you choose your time period from this drop-down box. And then the map will show the existing jurisdictions at the time frame. So this is 1817, and it shows the various jurisdictions. Or you could visit mapofus.org to follow the evolution of the county boundaries. But in any case, modern-day Walker County was not formed until 1823 and was part of Montgomery County territory in 1817. The Family Search Research Wiki is my go-to place for information. These articles include facts about the availability of each type of record that genealogists use, but more importantly, the dates that are covered. This shows the Research Wiki article for Walker County in Alabama. On the left side of the page, we see a listing of the topics covered by the article, including the all essential topic highlighted by the red arrow, record loss. And then close to the beginning of the page or the beginning of the article, you will find a box that identifies the dates for all the essential records in the county. Now, if I were to click on that link that says record loss, I would see Walker County had destructive courthouse fires in 1865, 1877, 1886, and 1932, at which point you groan. But all is not lost. One of the first things you need to do is determine what records have survived. After all, the courthouse is not the repository for all the types of records that a genealogist uses. There are numerous substitute records that may help you, including tax and land, assuming they weren't stored in the courthouse, of course, military records, newspapers, county histories, biographies. When record loss is involved, it becomes critically important to think outside the box and beyond your specific ancestor. You need to employ the FAN club strategy, and FAN stands for family and friends, associates, and neighbors. You need to identify your ancestors' fan club and then follow those individuals. Let's take a look at record types by jurisdiction. The county courthouse may have burned, and perhaps the tax, land, and probate records were all destroyed, but not all county records would have been stored in the courthouse. You need to find where record copies had been stored. Look at the local newspapers or county histories, or take your research up a jurisdictional level and look into state records. For example, Confederate pension applications are a state-level document, as are the original land patents and land lotteries. In fact, Georgia held land lotteries until 1833. You can go up even to the federal level, where you will find military service and pension records, except, of course, for the Civil War, passenger lists, naturalization, and census records, all of which can give you clues about your ancestor. Back to Walker County. What's left? First, check out the Family Search Catalog, and I'm showing this page and this process for those of you watching who are unfamiliar with the Family Search Catalog. To get to the catalog, you click on Search on the main page, select Catalog, and then in the place box, you fill it in with the state and county that you are looking for. Family Search will give you autofill a number of choices. I've selected the one that says United States, Alabama, Walker. So the next page shows you all the family history library records for Walker County. Some are digital, but some are only in book form. So if we click on taxation, which is the next to the last item on this page, we get the following screen. It shows us that there's not much available for the time period that was covered by the fires. From between 1840 and 1901, it looks like Family History Library doesn't have anything. But here's a tip. Look at the surrounding counties. Tuscaloosa, which is a neighboring county, has several sets of records from the mid-1800s, and they may include clues about your ancestor or the ancestors fan club. One of the most valuable steps that you can take if your ancestor's county has suffered record loss, is to seek out local libraries, genealogical societies, and archive repositories. In other words, make friends with your local librarian. These groups are in the best position to know what is available and for what time period. For the 5 states under discussion today, there are some amazing gems for you to explore. You are going to want to thoroughly check out online archives. This table, by the way, is reproduced in the handout, and it shows the major sources of digital archives for research in the Deep South. We've got, and I will be going over each one of these. This time I'm going to go through the states geographically, east to west, so I'm starting with South Carolina. The South Carolina Department of Archives and History is one of my new best friends in terms of online archival research. My personal favorite is their all-name index. For those of you with South Carolina relatives, you will find this site almost provides you with one-stop shopping. You can search by name, place, document type, dates, and more. In addition to land records, you can find criminal records, legislative files, land plats, and records of Confederate veterans. This slide illustrates some of the search options. The drop-down box on the left shows the name search, and you will note that the index does capture when enslaved individuals have been documented in the records in the archive, so they are included in the all-name index. On the right-hand side, the drop-down box is by topics, and I put in land, and we've got a variety of different land type records at the archives. Moving west, we go to Georgia's Virtual Vault. This is another archival gem for genealogical researchers. This is the main search page for the vault, and the collections are arranged alphabetically. So on a single screen, you can't see them all the collections. You would have to move on to additional pages. Among the items on this page are Bible records, colonial conveyances, colonial plats, yay, colonial estate records. On subsequent pages, you will find death certificates, marriage records, headright and bounty plats, colonial wills, as well as Confederate records. The Alabama Department of Archives and History has a separate page for their digital offerings, as shown here. They have maps and blueprints. I'm a big fan of maps. They have the 1867 and 1875 voter registration books, which we will talk about a bit later. They've got Reconstruction and Civil War newspapers, in addition to genealogy and historical publications, and a historical journal, the Alabama Historical Quarterly. This screen shows the catalog search page at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The Mississippi Archives, in terms of their online options, it's not quite as robust from a genealogical perspective as the previous 3 states, but if you can physically get there, you will find a lot of very helpful collections. You've got African American Confederate pension applications here, African American newspaper holdings, cemetery indexes, Freedmen's Bureau information. There is a lot of very useful information at the Mississippi Archives. For Louisiana researchers, you have options. In addition to the Louisiana State Archives, maintained by the Secretary of State, there's the Louisiana Digital Library, which is a consortium of libraries, educational institutions, and museums. Generally, searching by keyword, subject, or repository is the way to go when you're searching this particular resource. Now, the lack of vital record data prior to the 20th century for most of the Deep South states really pains us genealogists. So you must know your record dates. As you can see from this chart, some counties and parishes kept birth, marriage, and death records before the 20th century, but not many. If you're seeking a marriage record, South Carolina may be your most frustrating state, as not even the counties kept marriage records before the state initiated record keeping in 1911. Check your family search research wiki for your particular state. So what do you do if a government record is not available? Well, some alternatives include church registers, which will capture baptisms, marriages, and sometimes burials. Cemetery records, which will give you the death year and sometimes the birth year. Family Bibles. Now, family Bibles may be rarer than some of these other sources, but when they are kept concurrent with the events they are capturing, they are an extremely valuable resource. World War I and World War II draft records give birth date and place. And did you know that it's a great place to find a man's middle name? Check out those draft registrations. The census will allow you to estimate a birth year, and of course newspaper records, especially those from the latter part of the 19th century, can really help you. Let's consider colonial church records first. To find church records of a baptism or marriage, you need to know the denomination of your ancestor, and geographic location of your ancestor offers some clues that may help you. This particular map is from the Routledge Historical Atlas of Religion, which is a wonderful resource about the development of the different denominations in the United States. This map shows South Carolina and Georgia and the three predominant religions in the colonial period. Along the coast, we have the Anglicans. Church of England was a state religion, and all the extant parish registers for South Carolina Anglican Church of England records have been published. So if you've got colonial ancestors from that part of South Carolina, you're in luck. Towards the middle and the mountain area of South Carolina, you've got the Presbyterians, which is not surprising since many of the Scots-Irish did settle in the mountains of South Carolina. And then we have the Methodist as represented by the orange. This map is also from the Routledge Historical Atlas, and it shows the different European nations that claimed territory, which covered the Deep South. And you will see that for the Mississippi River area, it was controlled by the French. Therefore, the predominant religion in colonial period for Louisiana was predominantly Roman Catholic. There was virtually no settlement in Alabama and Mississippi, so there are no extant church records. Now, the 19th and 20th century saw an explosive growth in Baptist and Methodist religions as a result of what is known as the Second Great Awakening. This movement was led by charismatic preachers and featured large revivals which resulted in the conversion of thousands of frontier dwellers to the Methodist and Baptist denominations. Once you know your ancestors' religion, you may seek out records locally or records that are preserved by the national level of these various organizations. Now, one side note, although it was not one of the predominant religious groups in the South, there were at least two major Jewish communities, one in Savannah, Georgia, and the other in Charleston, South Carolina. No matter where you're doing your research, you need to anchor your family to a time and a specific place. Place is not just the state, but the county or parish within the state. And where vital records are not available, Census can provide you with clues. But unfortunately, the earliest censuses may be missing. The first column of this table shows the state and the year of statehood. South Carolina was the only state among our subjects with the earliest 1790 census. Georgia's 1790 census was lost, and the other three states were not really in existence. It wasn't until 1810 when the three most southern states appear in the federal census, either as states, Louisiana was a state, was becoming a state, or territories, Alabama and Mississippi. In 1820, there is still spotty coverage, but by 1830, all 5 states had good census coverage. So in addition to helping you determine your ancestor's approximate year of birth, censuses help place your ancestor. So in this case, I am looking at the William Sant, who is found across 70 years. He was born in 1850 in Marshall County, Alabama, and he died in Hinds County, Mississippi in 1920. And I've plotted these various census locations on a Google map. This sort of exercise is particularly useful if you live, for example, in the Pacific Northwest and have no personal knowledge of your ancestors' homeland. It really helps to display where they lived. So we've covered strategies for burned counties and missing vital records, and I'd now like to move on to several types of records that play a much larger role for genealogical research in the Deep South and in perhaps some other areas. Starting with land records. Land records provide a number of clues. For example, sometimes a land record will state that the land being sold was acquired through the estate of a deceased ancestor, or perhaps the sale is from a parent to a child. So the land record can be used as proof of kinship. If the wife gives a dower release, you learn the first name of the spouse at the time of the sale. It also helps you determine, was my ancestor still living, say in 1840? And of course, it helps you determine where your ancestor lived. But as I showed earlier with both the Newbery Atlas map and the map of US, county boundaries changed frequently in the early decades of statehood in all of these states. Your Family Search Research Wiki is a very good source for information about the available land records, and you use the Family Search catalog to find those records. Now, lesser known gems for land records, the South Carolina Department of Archives and History and Georgia Virtual Vault both have great land collections. Here we have an example from South Carolina, the Fairfield district. Here we have Peter Knighton and James Knighton, who are selling 145 acres of land to their brother, Moses Knighton. And the key interesting feature of this particular deed was left by our father to us. So these 3 sons all received land, and Peter and James are giving up, selling their share of the inheritance. Tax records are another key record group for researching in the Deep South. As with census, they place a person at a specific place at a specific time. They give you information usually in the decade, or rather the years between censuses. It gives you a picture of your ancestors' wealth. It also helps identify how many enslaved individuals your ancestor may have had in their household. Following tax records over time may show a death, a person suddenly disappears from the tax record, or when a son came of age and is suddenly eligible to be captured by the poll or head tax. But this means that you need to become familiar with the state laws of the time. This example is from a project attempting to identify the parents of Samuel Allen, who's the gentleman at the top, and land and other records already suggest that he had a brother, a William Allen, but neither Samuel nor William left records that suggest who their parents were. So to expand the research, the fan club principle, the decision was made to identify all Allen males in Warren County, Georgia in 1794. Any one of these individuals may be a sibling or a relative, and they may have left information about the parents. So what we were looking for in that previous table is looking at the water courses to place them on a map, and also looking at the specific tax district. Samuel and William Adam both had land, were taxed on land on Rocky Comfort Creek. The only problem is Rocky Comfort Creek is actually rather long in this locale. But James and Reuben Allen were on Joe's Creek. Joe's Creek and Rocky Comfort, or at least part of Rocky Comfort, are close together. So the proximity here is something that we were looking for, plus the James and Samuel were in the same tax district, suggesting again that there was a geographic proximity. So you have to combine the information to help give you clues. James, in fact, was a brother, but he didn't leave any information about his parents either. Phooey. Where do you find tax records? Well, Ancestry and Family Search have good collections, as do the various state archives. But sometimes you have to go to tax legislation to figure out parts of what you're looking at. The Georgia Archives, when it talks about the tax records that were available, if the digest dates are very early, think 1794, a glance at Ruth Blair's Some Early Tax Digest of Georgia will provide a complete transcript. Well, not quite. See this little thing over here? It sort of looks like QUA and then maybe Y, could be quantity, could be quality, and then there are these numbers. Well, what on earth do those numbers mean? You have to go to the tax legislation itself. So this was a digest of tax laws that were in force prior to 1851, and this was 1804. It describes that the land in terms of first quality, it has the highest tax, second quality, slightly lower taxed, etc. And pine lands were at the bottom end of the pole, so to speak. But you are not given any enlightenment on what quality land looks like, so apparently the tax surveyors knew it by looking at it. Probate is the third essential type of record for research in the Deep South, and you will want to look at the entire probate packet. A packet may include the petition to administer the estate, usually filed by relatives, keep that in mind, letters of administration, which names the executor, usually a relative. If you're lucky, you get a will that names wife and children, or even you may get names of debtors. Then there's the inventory. And there are two types of probate: testate with a will and intestate without a will. So you will need to know the county where a person died in order to access this. You can find probate on both Ancestry and Family Search, and this information is in the handout as well. In Family Search, you usually access probate by going to the catalog and entering the state and the county, then scrolling down to the probate records. Sometimes Family Search has created collections. So in this case, they've taken all the county records and combined them into Alabama estate files, 1830 to 1976. But do read the fine print. So here we have a little note that says, files from Madison, Monroe, and Talladega counties have not been indexed. So in other words, if you put the name in here, you're not going to pop them up. But in this case, I'm looking for probate for Alexander Smith in Bibb County, Alabama. This is the folder from his 1819 probate. It lists that at that point he had 5 enslaved individuals, and they are named by name, and it also names his wife and his son. So probate can be very helpful in your research. This is the actual will for Alexander Smith, and as you can see, it's quite faded, but it does confirm the information that was on the outside of the packet. Probate may be the only place to find an enslaved ancestor's name before emancipation. So my next example comes from the GU 272 project. On the 19th of June in 1838, the Jesuits of Georgetown College contracted to sell 272 enslaved persons to 2 sugar plantation owners in Louisiana, Jesse Batty and Henry Johnson. The sale raised about what would be $3.3 million today, and Richard Cellini has founded the Georgetown Memory Project to determine what happened to these individuals, and the genealogical research was led by Judy Rifle. American Ancestors has a page that helps descendants and researchers access the family trees of the 272 individuals. This is the inventory of Jesse Batty's estate after he died in 1851. This inventory is remarkable in the detail it includes about the families and the family groups. So over here as item 23, and I'm only going to read a little bit of it, Caroline, John Scott's wife, Negro woman, aged 32 years, and her 6 children, Lida Ann, aged 10, all the way down to Robert, 9 months. The database at American Ancestors has a biographical sketch of the youngest, actually of all of them, but this is the one for Robert Scott and his descendants. It gives born about 1850, which is what we see from the inventory, and gives the information about his wife and his children. Moving on to Confederate military records. You can find them 3 different, you can find the records at Fold 3 and at State Archives and the National Archives, but you can find whether your ancestor served in the U.S. National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors database. Fold 3 specializes in military records. The Civil War records, you can search by the Confederate titles. The pensions themselves are not online. You do have to order them from the National Archives, but there are a number of record groups that are helpful to your research. Federal agencies, I mentioned the National Archives. They have a number of Confederate records for not only medical personnel, but hospital records if your ancestor had been wounded. The National Park Service, as I've mentioned, has the Soldiers and Sailors database. Both Family Search and Ancestry have very good Confederate records, including Ancestry's African American Sailor Index. Okay, I'd like to move on to tips for researching your African American ancestor. Before the Civil War, most of the enslaved population of the U.S. lived south of the Mason-Dixon line. This plate is also from Charles Paulin's Atlas of Historical Geography, and it shows the percentage of each county's population that was enslaved based on the 1850 census. In this plate, you will see that the solid black shading representing an enslaved population of greater than 50% is concentrated along the Mississippi River and the middle of Alabama and middle of Georgia and most of South Carolina. By 1860, almost 60% of South Carolina's population was enslaved, and Mississippi was not far behind at 55%. There were free persons of color in these states, but the absolute numbers of individuals was low. The highest proportions of free persons of color were in Louisiana at almost 3%, and this was concentrated in New Orleans, and in South Carolina in the Charlestown area at 1.4%. So researching African American ancestors can be very challenging and requires some creative searching methods. If you ever needed to use the fan club method, it is with African American research. Free persons of color before the Civil War should show up in traditional genealogical resources such as census records. But numerous roadblocks put up by states may mean that these people were not documented. And then there's the 1870 brick wall. Many African Americans find it difficult to trace their family earlier than 1870, as the 1870 census was the first federal census following emancipation and the first to record the formerly enslaved individual with a surname of their own choosing. So if your ancestor was among the many who were enslaved, tracing the family backward usually requires researching the enslaver's family, since most of the records, such as probate, account, deeds, were all in the enslaver's name. Resources for free persons of color vary depending on where they lived. First, you want to establish your ancestor's location with the U.S. Federal Census. You might also take a look at Carter Woodson's book, Free Negro Heads of Families, in the 1830s. This was based on the 1830 census. You can look at the entire book. It's digitized on Family Search. And then there was something known as the Free Persons of Color Registers. Free persons of color were required to register with a government jurisdiction, such as a city or a county, to prove that they were free and to prevent them from being re-enslaved. Many of these early registers have disappeared. I do know that there are registers for Georgia and Louisiana and Madison County in Alabama, but the local archives should have the most up-to-date information on what has survived. If your ancestor was formerly enslaved, but given their freedom before the Civil War, you might find them in the indentures and manumissions file at Family Search, but it only covers Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. The U.S. Federal Census should also have them. This is from 1850 in New Orleans. We see John Heckman Carpenter, he's listed as a mulatto. We've got Edward Evening, a boat steward, also listed as a mulatto. Further down the page, we've got Lucy Carter, black, and Ann Carter, black as well. So when you're looking at these early censuses and your ancestor is a free person of color, do pay attention to how your ancestor's race is captured. It may help you bridge the decades and figure out whether or not you've got the right record. For pre-Civil War records of enslaved persons, you need to have a hypothesis about the name of the enslaver. Not necessarily is it going to be the name of the enslaver at the time of manumission. You need to consider geography clues post-Civil War. In the 1870 census or the 1866 census and the 1867 voter registrations, you can find clues about where they were living. And then there were other types of records that may name your ancestors, such as shipping manifests, deeds, and probate. This is an example of a shipping manifest. Although the importation of Africans as slaves was banned in 1808, the coastal shippers continued to do a brisk trade in human lives. This is a manifest from 1844 and shows the shipping of persons from Richmond, Virginia to New Orleans, Louisiana. It's unusual in that it does give surnames for most of the individuals, but it also names who the shipper was and who the person purchasing the individuals in New Orleans was. These types of lists need to be used with much other evidence to help you identify whether or not you found your ancestor. And then there's the 1870 brick wall. There are clues that you can get from this census that help you work back. Who was in your ancestor's family? What are the names of the people that are part of your ancestor's family? Who were your ancestor's neighbors? Look carefully at the people on either side of them and around them. There are several unique resources for after the Civil War. First, Alabama and Mississippi had state censuses in 1866. The voter registration lists in 1867 in Georgia and Alabama are the first time that you will find people of color being able to register to vote. And Louisiana has voter lists for the Orleans Parish only. The next three items I will talk about on the next slides. The Freedmen's Bank. It was chartered by Congress in 1865 and it failed in 1874. Has extensive demographic information. The very earliest books may give the name of the enslaver and the name of the plantation. These various different branch dates are the dates that they were founded, and you will find most of these records on Family Search. This is a Freedmen's Bank record from 1868. On the right-hand side, we see William Hobbs. And you will notice on this pre-printed form, it does have name of master, name of mistress. It's been crossed out, but it also has plantation. And it says here, William Hobbs on Hobbs Island in the Tennessee River. It gives information about his mother, his wife, his children, and his place of birth, 8 miles from Huntsville on Hobbs Place. So if your ancestor did make a deposit in the Freedmen's Bank, you have extensive genealogical information available to you. The The Freedmen's Bureau was established to supervise relief efforts after the war. One of the more important items was registering marriages and also establishing the labor contracts between the freedmen and the plantation owners. Use the website Discover Freedmen, which has indexed all these records. And this is an example of a Freedmen's Bureau contract. It names people over here by name, including Mr. William Hobbs, who was on the previous page. And this is the contract that he had for work after the Civil War. And then there's the Southern Claims Commission. Southerners from 12 states could apply for reimbursement if they could prove loyalty to the Union during the war or had their stores taken by the Union Army. Only about 30% of the claims were approved, but these claims are very rich in details about the family. So in summary then, you need to educate yourself about your ancestors' state and county, including the dates of record availability. Become very familiar with the local archives. When record loss is an issue, seek alternative sources and use the fan club strategy. Seek vital record substitutes such as church records or newspapers. Don't forget that land, tax, and probate are essential records in your toolkit for Deep South research. And for African American research, explore the rich material that is available immediately after the Civil War to expand your research horizon.
All right, well, thank you so much, Anne, for your presentation. So before we get to the Q&A, I do want to share with everyone just a few of our upcoming programs. So next Tuesday on June 15th, we welcome author Gabrielle Glazer, who will talk about her most recent book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. She will be in conversation with Peter O'Dowd, the senior editor for Here and Now, which is a radio show produced by WBUR Boston. And she will discuss kind of the truth about post-war adoption in the United States. And if you were tuning into today's program to learn more about, say, your Acadian ancestors who ended up in Louisiana, be sure to consider participating in our upcoming online course on researching Acadian ancestors to really take those Acadian roots back even further. And on July 8th, author Peter Canelos will discuss his recent work that details the life, family, and legacy of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan, known as the Great Dissenter for his work in defending American equality and civil rights, and most notable, his 1896 dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. To learn more and to register for these programs, please visit americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. All right, so let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time provided. So we have a question from Christopher who says, with colonial land grants being in the tens of thousands of acres, what happened to those land grants after the Revolution? Were they null? Did they remain? Were they divided up? What happened to them?
They were usually divided up, and you would need to go to the county records in each state to find out how they were divided. Yes, the original patents are sometimes enormous, but they were all divided eventually and sold, hopefully at a or at least that's why they were made to individuals to make a profit and resell the bits and pieces.
Now, Virginia asks, do you know where I could find records about steamboats that operated on the Mississippi River?
Off the top of my head, I do not. But if I would check out Family Search, actually, to see if they've got anything on river records.
And possibly, local historical societies or archives. I would
Oh, true,
imagine,
true.
if you know
Yes,
where
I'm sorry.
if you know where the steamboat company was operating out of, maybe looking at local repositories to that, I would think.
Yeah, I would definitely contact the state um, uh, archives and see what they have available.
And Raymond asks, where can you find Freedmen's Bureau records?
Those are available online at Family Search. If you type in Discover Freedman in your URL, that will take you to a page where you can search by a name, and that will then link you to the Family Search records.
All right, great, thanks. And you also mentioned, Angelica asks if you can share where to find the ship manifests that you mentioned.
They were also on, I think the one that I showed I got from Family Search, but you will find some on Ancestry as well. When you are looking for those ships manifests, I would recommend, I keep going back to the Family Search research wikis. Each state has a separate wiki on African American resources, and they almost always link to those shipping manifests.
Great, thank you. At one point in the presentation, you mentioned that it's important to become familiar with the laws of the place and time to understand maybe tax records or inheritance and just a number of other things. How do you get familiar with the laws of the time? I mean, are there resources that you kind of go to if you're trying to figure out, some of those legal parameters?
There are a couple of resources. There is something called the Red Book, which you could purchase, but it is now available online, which will talk to you, which will tell you about key dates for a particular state. The Legal Genealogist, which is a page maintained by Judy Russell, is also another great source of information about legal matters. You can go to the state archives and look at the legislative records. Some of the state archives have abstracted information that pertains, say, to marriage laws. As a one-stop shopping. So it will vary depending on your state, but do check out The Legal Genealogist by Judy Russell, and also check out the Red Book and also The Source, which I believe are available on Roots Web. Let's see, Red Book. Let me just check. Wrong. Nope,
Well,
sorry.
and we
It's
can
not
find
coming up
that, and I
quick.
can
Sorry.
include it in my follow-up email as well as a resource, as an additional
Okay.
resource. Now, let's see, just a few more questions. Jackie says, when multiple children inherit land from a parent, does it usually pass as joint tenancy or tenants in common? Or does that also depend on the state and the laws at the time?
It would depend on the state. Usually what I've seen is the parent says, John gets the tract of land here and Joe gets the tract of land over there, as opposed to the situation that we saw in that South Carolina record, where the father simply said, my sons get the land. You would have to look at the original record itself to see how it passed, as well as explore information from the state archives and the state registry.
All right. Let's see. maybe just one more question. Sarah asks, where would I find records on the Huguenots in South Carolina?
I would go first to my favorite source, Family Search Research Wiki. They probably have a separate article, or at least in their article about religions in South Carolina, they should have a section on the Huguenots. Another source of information on Huguenots that I've found helpful is actually Hathi Trust, which is a digital library, and they frequently publish or make available books that are out of print. So anything that describes older history, and that could include Huguenot migration to South Carolina, might in fact be on Hathi Trust.
All right. Well, thank you again, Anne, for a fantastic presentation. As I mentioned at the start of the program, this has been recorded. It will be posted to our website and YouTube channel starting later today. And I do want to also just let you know that if you are interested in, or maybe you have more specific questions about your family history research, maybe you've hit a brick wall, maybe you need assistance with your research, you may consider hiring our research services team or using our expanded chat service. The chat service puts you in direct communication with a genealogist. It's a great place if you have a quick reference question, maybe you're not sure where to go for a certain type of resource, so definitely take advantage of chat. It's a free service open to the public, and we do have new hours for that service starting next week as we begin to reopen our research center in Boston. So those chat hours will actually be Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and it can be accessed at americanancestors.org/chat. And I will be including some of this information to these services, as well as the Red Book, which Anne mentioned, a link to that in my follow-up email to you later today. So I want to thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for others. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.